By the time the alarms finally matched the paperwork, the damage had already been done. Evidence logs didn't line up. Security rounds existed on paper that never happened in real time. And the people responsible weren't inmates. They were staff. What followed would quietly end careers, expose weaknesses inside the most restrictive prison in the United States, and force federal investigators to admit something few outside ever hear. Even at the highest level of security, the system can fail from the inside. The facility was ADX Florence, a prison designed around the assumption that human error must be eliminated because the stakes are too high to tolerate it. By the time the internal reviews reached Washington, the question was no longer whether rules had been broken. It was how long the breaches had gone unnoticed. ADX Florence, located in Colorado, holds inmates the federal government considers too dangerous, too influential, or too disruptive for any other prison. The security model depends on repetition, documentation, and absolute compliance. Every door movement is logged. Every round is recorded. Every interaction is supposed to be visible, accountable, and controlled. That structure leaves little room for improvisation. And no room at all for misconduct. But the first red flags didn't come from an escape attempt or a violent incident. They came from paperwork. Routine audits inside the federal prison system are designed to catch small inconsistencies before they become large ones. In this case, investigators noticed irregularities in shift reports and supervisory reviews. Certain officers appeared to be completing required security checks with unusual speed. Others logged interactions that could not be independently verified by camera footage or electronic access records. At first, supervisors treated it as administrative sloppiness. But that explanation didn't hold. When internal compliance teams compared logs against surveillance data, they found gaps. Some rounds had never occurred. Some doors were marked as checked without ever being opened. And in a facility where inmate isolation is total, missing a round is not a clerical error. It is a security failure. The investigation widened. And that's when the misconduct shifted from procedural to personal. Federal investigators determined that several staff members had violated Bureau of Prisons policies in ways that went far beyond negligence. Officers were found to have falsified security checks. Others had unauthorized contact with inmates. In a small number of cases, contraband was introduced into secure areas through staff channels. That detail mattered, because ADX Florence is built on the premise that inmates have no access to outside influence. When that barrier breaks, the entire security logic collapses. What followed shocked even experienced investigators. Some employees were discovered to have formed inappropriate relationships with inmates. These were not accidental encounters. They were repeated interactions that bypassed safeguards designed to prevent familiarity, favoritism, or manipulation. In at least one documented case, communication occurred outside approved channels, directly violating federal prison regulations. At this point, the Bureau of Prisons could no longer handle the matter internally. The Office of the Inspector General stepped in, initiating formal inquiries into staff conduct at the facility. These investigations are rare at ADX Florence, not because misconduct never occurs, but because the environment is structured to make violations difficult to hide. When breaches do surface, they are treated as systemic threats. Several employees were removed from duty during the investigation. Others were reassigned while evidence was reviewed. The outcomes varied, but the consequences were consistent. Firings. Forced resignations. Federal discipline. For a prison designed to neutralize risk, the realization was unsettling. The danger hadn't come from inmates breaching the system. It came from staff choosing not to follow it. But that wasn't the worst part. Investigators concluded that some of the violations had gone undetected for extended periods. That meant the safeguards were only as strong as the people enforcing them. Cameras recorded, but footage wasn't always reviewed. Logs existed, but verification was inconsistent. Oversight assumed compliance instead of confirming it. In a conventional prison, those lapses might lead to contraband or fights. At ADX Florence, they threatened national security-level containment. The Bureau of Prisons faced an uncomfortable truth. Its most secure institution relied on human discipline in an environment designed to eliminate human discretion. That contradiction had finally caught up with it. Internal reports acknowledged failures in supervision. Senior staff were criticized for relying too heavily on self-reporting. Shift supervisors approved documentation without cross-checking. Compliance audits occurred, but they were predictable enough that some officers learned how to pass them without actually performing required tasks. The response was swift, but deliberately quiet. The Bureau implemented policy changes that were not publicly detailed. Staff rotations were adjusted. Supervisory review procedures were tightened. Randomized audits replaced scheduled ones. And disciplinary thresholds were lowered, meaning violations that once resulted in warnings now triggered termination. Several former employees later confirmed that the atmosphere inside the facility changed. Surveillance reviews increased. Supervisors became more visible. Minor infractions that would once have been overlooked now ended careers. The message was clear. The margin for error no longer existed. But questions remained. Why did it take so long for the breaches to surface? And how many violations were never discovered at all? Public reporting on ADX Florence is limited by design. Security details are classified or restricted. Staff discipline records are often sealed or summarized without names. What is known comes primarily from Inspector General summaries, court filings, and internal bureau acknowledgments. Those sources confirm firings. They confirm misconduct. But they do not always explain how the environment allowed it to happen. One explanation lies in repetition. ADX Florence operates on routines so strict they can become mechanical. Officers perform the same actions, the same checks, the same documentation every shift. Over time, familiarity breeds complacency. Procedures designed to ensure safety begin to feel symbolic rather than essential. When that happens, the system depends entirely on integrity. Investigators noted that most staff followed protocols correctly. The breaches were committed by a small number of employees. But in a facility like ADX, a small number is enough. Another factor was staffing pressure. Federal prisons have long struggled with recruitment and retention, especially in high-stress assignments. ADX Florence is no exception. Officers work long hours in an environment that offers little interaction and constant vigilance. Burnout is common. And burnout creates risk. That does not excuse misconduct. But it explains how warning signs can be missed. As disciplinary actions concluded, the Bureau of Prisons made a rare public acknowledgement that staff misconduct posed a serious threat to institutional security. The language was restrained. The tone was bureaucratic. But the implication was serious. If the highest security prison in the country could be compromised from within, no facility was immune. The aftermath extended beyond Florence. Training protocols across the federal system were reviewed. Emphasis was placed on ethical boundaries, documentation integrity, and early reporting of irregular behavior. Supervisors were instructed to assume nothing and verify everything. Yet some observers noted the limits of reform. Policies can change. Oversight can increase. But prisons are still operated by people. And people can fail. Few people outside ever learn what happened next. Some of the fired staff attempted to appeal their terminations. Those appeals largely failed. Federal employment standards grant wide discretion in security-sensitive roles. Violations involving falsified records or inappropriate inmate contact leave little room for reinstatement. In certain cases, criminal charges were considered. But not all misconduct rises to that level. Many violations, while severe, remain administrative rather than prosecutorial. For the inmates housed at ADX Florence, the consequences were invisible. There were no mass transfers. No lockdowns announced to the public. The prison continued operating as designed. That continuity is part of the institution's philosophy. Stability, even after failure, is itself a form of control. But internally, trust had been damaged. The Bureau of Prisons had to confront a paradox. ADX Florence exists because the system believes some individuals require extreme control. Yet the breakdown came not from those individuals, but from the people assigned to manage them. That reality forced a reevaluation of assumptions. Security is not only about architecture, technology, or isolation. It is about accountability. When accountability weakens, even the strongest structures become vulnerable. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe, because the next one goes even deeper. Today, ADX Florence remains operational. Its reputation remains intact in public perception. But within the federal system, the lesson lingers. Rules only work when they are followed. Logs only matter when they are true. And the most secure prison in America is only as secure as the people trusted to run it. The firings were not a scandal in the traditional sense. There were no press conferences. No dramatic revelations. Just careers ending quietly, policies tightening silently, and a reminder that absolute security is an ideal, not a guarantee. In the end, the breaches did not lead to escapes or violence. But they exposed something more unsettling. Even where control is total, human failure is still possible. And that is the risk no prison can ever fully eliminate. If this story kept you watching, the next one will stay with you even longer. Subscribe for more real prison documentaries.